My presentation will cover kind of where we are in terms of global challenges, but also the policies and programs, and basically where some of you could maybe find some funding within our federal government in the United States. So I know that many of you come from abroad, so this is a little bit more geared towards the US, but hopefully some of you will be able to either partner with the US, or if you're based here, you can find some funding opportunities throughout the presentation. So I'm looking at some of the global challenges and then addressing some of the engineering solutions. So I know that throughout the conference, you all are looking at telehealth issues and medical device development, as well as access to water and electricity, access to broadband, and these sorts of really important humanitarian needs throughout the world. And so I will kind of go through what our Washington office does, and then launch into kind of where we are from a federal standpoint in terms of funding opportunities. So in terms of our DC priorities, we do a lot of research and development policy, particularly in the defense space. I look at NIST and NSF. So NIST does a little bit of everything. And so some folks might find some opportunities there in particular, for example, that you might not have thought of in the past. I work closely with the Department of Energy. We do aerospace policy and transportation. My colleague Erica does AI. So I know the prior speakers have touched on AI issues. I leave that subject to her, but certainly we do cover it in our office. And then quantum and IP patents, as well as high-skilled STEM immigration and entrepreneurship programs. As you all are coming up with ideas and initiatives, please let us know. We'd love to take your stories to Congress, but also help in any way we can in terms of facilitating conversations with the federal government. So federal agencies with some grant funding that you might be able to utilize or at least apply for include the National Institutes of Health, NASA, the State Department, USAID, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, Department of Energy, as well as the National Science Foundation. So in terms of the National Institutes of Health, our office doesn't interact with them as much, but we do understand that many of our members are interested in health issues, particularly in the COVID pandemic, as it relates to humanitarian tech, but also like solving the pandemic challenges that we're all facing. So I wanted to point you all to the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, which looks at understanding disease and detection, as well as diagnosis and treatment. The National Institutes of Environmental Health and Sciences, they look at discovering how environmental aspects affect people's lives. And then the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences, as well as the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. Some of you have touched on a lot of minority issues in the previous talks, so I wanted to highlight that one as well. In terms of NASA, most people don't think of NASA in terms of humanitarian tech issues. I look at NASA in terms of their work on remote sensing for environmental monitoring. Some of the satellite services are definitely useful in telemedicine and telehealth access, as well as remote access to education. So for those who are looking at providing education access to remote parts of the world, some of the funding could potentially come from NASA, since it is a satellite service issue. The NASA Health Research Program for deep space also does have implications for life on Earth. So for those of you in the health sector, NASA is doing a bit of health research, as is actually the Department of Defense does quite a bit of health research as well. And those are two agencies you wouldn't necessarily think of doing that type of research. And they're doing it for specific populations, but in general, that research translates to having broader effects and broader implications for the rest of society. So in terms of the State Department, I wanted to touch on a few different bureaus. The Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental Scientific Affairs, the Bureau of Energy Resources, the Office of Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, as well as the Office of Global Partnerships. So IEEE has a fellowship program at the State Department, which I'll highlight at the end of my talk. But for those of you who are able to get a federal clearance, that's kind of the caveat there. I know a lot of you are international, but for those of you able to get a US clearance, that might be something to consider in terms of either for a gap year, or if you're going on sabbatical. For those of you in academia, we do have a program where we place fellows in the State Department to look at energy and tech issues humanitarian tech issues. And you can go through actually the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, and then be placed in either that office or a different office within the State Department. So in terms of the Bureau of Oceans and International and Environmental and Scientific Affairs, this covers a lot of different subjects. So there's the conservation and water section, there's the environmental quality section, the global change section, international health and biodefense, marine conservation, ocean and polar affairs, and scientific and technical cooperations, as well as space affairs. So in a lot of cases, these offices are looking at international partnerships, but also given where we are in terms of the global pandemic, and given where we are in terms of the Biden administration's one of the top priorities being combating climate change. A lot of these offices are seeing a lot more resources being dumped into them through our funding process, the appropriations and the authorization process that Congress goes through every year as we decide on federal funding. So a lot of these offices are very much staffing up. About a year ago, we were reaching out to some of these offices, and they have very little staff, and now they're 10 staff bigger. And so a lot of these offices are really trying to ramp up their efforts. And so I know I talked about these in the previous conference, but I wanted to highlight them again, just to showcase that they're really, really building up some of these offices within the State Department. So in terms of the Bureau of Energy Resources, I wanted to highlight a couple of different initiatives. The Middle East Strategic Alliance, which is a multilateral collaboration on energy development, specific to the Middle East. So for those of you interested in that region, I would perhaps suggest looking at that. There's a Transatlantic Energy Security and Resource Government Program, as well as technical assistance in general on energy development and energy security. So IEEE had a fellow in this office a couple of years ago, and he was able to focus on one region. So in general, the staff of this office are regionally focused. Our fellow was focused on Eastern Europe, and his main project was the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but also he focused on just energy resources for that part of Europe that's a little bit less developed than Western Europe, for example. So this office does focus on international energy policy, and does divide up their staff in terms of regions. So they're looking at energy policy throughout the world, and they're looking at establishing energy markets that are transparent, and as well as just sound energy policies throughout the world. In terms of the Office of Science and Technology Advisor, this covers all areas of foreign policy. In the Obama administration, they kind of had 10 different priorities, actually led by the staff of that office. In the Trump administration, this office was diminished. And then now in the Biden administration, they're really ramping up kind of the work of this office and trying to look at science and tech as it relates to the State Department's work in cybersecurity and energy security, in providing for hunger issues and other global humanitarian issues. They're addressing topics from AI to business partnerships, water development, and climate change. I did want to touch on the Afghanistan and Ukraine conflict. So IEEE did form a task force within the State Department and also the White House to look at kind of what the engineering community and the STEM community is facing in those areas and within that conflict. So they are focused on kind of how to support not only like the general public, but also like the energy research resources in those areas and that sort of thing. So I wanted to highlight kind of those two conflicts as an area that IEEE has certainly weighed in on within the State Department. But for those of you looking at funding opportunities, I would say maybe reach out to some of these offices within the state to see where you could find partnerships, because they are really looking at global partnerships. So the Office of Global Partnerships would be probably a first stop. And they've already established over 1,600 partnerships and have provided about $4 billion in public and private resources to partnerships and projects all over the world. So in terms of those of you who are looking at trying to enhance diplomacy and development outcomes, looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example, this would be an office to reach out to where you could look into partnering and finding some other financial resources for your work. USAID has, of course, also really ramped up their STEM work. In the past year, they've not only increased their staff, but their budget has greatly increased in the Biden administration. This has been global health and COVID issues have certainly become obviously at the forefront of the administration and weigh in on the budget decisions of this agency in particular, given the breadth of all the countries that they send staff to. So in terms of USAID, some of the offices that might be of interest to some of you all include the Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure, the Global Health Office, the Innovation, Technology, and Research Office, the Water and Sanitation Program, as well as the Partnerships Office. So in terms of this office, there's coordination of natural resource management, renewable energy development, and climate resilience programs. So the climate resilience programs have obviously received a lot more support in this administration. And so that funding level is just higher. So their staff are able to focus a lot more on climate resilience. And so for those of you interested in that area, this would be an office and an area to look into. They do partner with some of the DOE national labs, the Department of Energy national labs, and I wanted to highlight in particular the National Renewable Energy Lab. The Global Health Program covers more of the kind of health crisis that we're all in, but also Ebola and HIV/AIDS and other health issues that are maybe less talked about and less at the forefront of the news cycle. But they are looking at protecting populations from vulnerable diseases all over the world, so not just COVID. The Technology and Innovation Research Program leverages STEM and innovation tech in general throughout the USAID. They're looking at things like digital strategy, AI, partnering with entrepreneurs. So this might be another area for those of you interested in funding opportunities, but also partnership opportunities. The Water and Sanitation Program is obviously focused on those issues. Moving on to NIST. NIST is an agency that IEEE advocates for in a lot of contexts. We look at both their funding level, but also the fact that they are under-resourced in terms of facilities, but they do a lot of research in terms of developing standards as well as like basic research. So not all people think of NIST in terms of humanitarian organization, but some of their really broad research areas do cover humanitarian tech. So I like to include it in these types of discussions. Their fire research program, for example, is really great. They have conducted a lot of different research on how fires burn, which is helpful for those of you who are looking at those issues in other countries. They have entire burn sites where they burn buildings down regularly and then research how that fire did that and what the effects were. And they do a lot of basic research on fire. So for those of you looking at environmental research, I wanted to point that program out in particular. But they also do a lot of building and planning in terms of earthquake. For those of you who are in, say, earthquake areas throughout the world, some of the research NIST does on earthquakes and on building structure and design and that sort of thing to prevent the fall of all these buildings in an earthquake, that might be another area of research that you could look into in terms of this agency. Their environmental research program is another one. And then they also do cybersecurity and advanced communications, as well as energy and other topics. I wanted to point to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program at NIST, because that one partners with small businesses throughout the US. So each state has an office focused on the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program. So by the state office, you could find different partnerships, but also different federal resources to help build small businesses and medium-sized businesses in many different areas of manufacturing, but including some of you who are in the humanitarian sector as well. The National Science Foundation is a little bit more focused on basic research, but I did want to touch on their kind of cross-cutting and their more like policy-focused kind of subjects. So what the NSF does is every 10 years they pick 10 big ideas. And so these are the list of the current 10 big ideas, but some of them are of course environmentally focused. And so you'll have both the offices of, say, polar programs and geosciences, as well as the engineering programs, but then you'll have some other NSF funding that is that is a little bit broader, harnessing the data revolution, convergence research, some of these more climate-focused office or big ideas are another area where the federal government is really looking at some of these humanitarian tech topics that you all are actively involved in. So I wanted to highlight the NSF's work in these areas as well. Some of their cross-cutting programs, including women participation in STEM through the advanced program. For those of you who are early career faculty, I wanted to highlight the Faculty Early Career Development Program. That's funding for early career faculty in all areas of research, not just humanitarian tech, but since some of you are starting out your careers, I thought I would highlight that. The Industry University Cooperative Research Centers, the long-term ecological research, National Nanotechnology Coordinated Infrastructure, and then research experience for undergrads. So I know a lot of us have been through REUs, but in terms of the NSF support of those, I wanted to make sure to highlight them as well. In terms of the Department of Energy, I've listed a lot of different offices here. They do a lot of work with grid development that IEEE has been involved in. So for those of you interested in grid issues, particularly those of you developing and looking at microgrids and mini grids in remote areas, I would certainly point to the Department of Energy. Those of you looking at AI issues as they relate to some of your humanitarian tech work, the Department of Energy does have an AI office, so I wanted to point to that as well. The clean energy focus of the Biden administration is definitely prevalent in the Department of Energy. And so we're looking at huge increases in funding, huge increases in staff here, and huge increases in just a focus on electricity and providing access, fixing the grids so that people can get broadband access. And I know that a lot of that research can translate to abroad, because obviously we do have remote areas in this country, but we also are supportive of other countries fixing some of their grid issues and that sort of thing. So the DOE does operate throughout the world. And I wanted to point to some of these offices in case that's helpful to you all looking at funding. So they're looking to catalyze basic and applied research. And the collaborations between academia, government, and the private sector is something that IEEE has certainly been involved in, both in the humanitarian space, but also in other just areas of energy policy within the Department of Energy. For those of you in states with national labs, there might be some opportunities there, either to use the lab from a user standpoint, but also just looking at the battery research or the energy tech research, the AI and the quantum research going on there. Each lab, of course, generally has a specialty, but some are a little bit more broad. The DOE weatherization program is another one I wanted to highlight, only because a lot of it is energy efficiency related. So for those of you looking at energy efficiency issues in renewable energy, providing clean energy in maybe low income areas, that sort of thing, the DOE does a lot of that. And that can expand into more of the humanitarian tech space. So here's a little bit of info on the State Department program. The year-long fellowship is in Washington, D.C., so you would have to be in D.C. Now that we're kind of back in the office after COVID. It runs from September 1st through through August 31st every year, and the deadline for applications is the 9th of December. So you have some time if any of you are interested. There is a website here. Happy to point you to my colleague Erica, who manages that program. If any of you have any questions that are specific to the program, if they're super general questions, I might be able to answer them, but I wanted to definitely flag this for any of you who are interested. That's it for my presentation. So happy to answer questions if any of you have them.
All right, we have time for one question, maybe most. You're running behind. Okay. Question?